Something is happening right now that most people in the Western world have absolutely no idea about, and it's not some small, incremental development in a lab somewhere. It's a full-scale, coordinated, nationally funded effort to put human beings on the surface of the moon. Not in some distant hypothetical future. Not in a vague, maybe someday timeline, before the end of this decade. And the country doing it isn't the United States. It isn't a private company funded by a billionaire with a rocket obsession. It's China. And if you think that sounds like an exaggeration, or a headline designed to get a reaction, then this video is going to genuinely surprise you. Because when you actually look at what China has done over the last 15 years, what it is doing right now, and what it has already tested and launched and landed, the picture that emerges is not the picture of a country playing catch-up. It's the picture of a country that made a plan, stuck to it, funded it properly, and is now executing it with a precision and a speed that NASA, for all of its brilliance and history, is currently struggling to match. If this is the kind of story you want to understand properly, stay right here, because we are going to go deep. And if you want more videos like this one, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of thing we cover. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of China's space program, but the beginning of the moon race that most people don't even realize is happening. It is the year 2004. NASA is riding a wave of public enthusiasm following the successful Mars exploration rover missions. Spirit and Opportunity have just landed on Mars and are sending back stunning images. The agency is focused on the International Space Station, on the shuttle program, on Mars. The moon at this point feels like old news. Humans last walked on it in December 1972, and the general attitude inside NASA and across much of the American public is that been there, done that. The moon is a stepping stone. Mars is the destination. The moon is yesterday's problem. In China, the year 2004 is the year the government officially approves a program called Chang'e, named after the goddess of the moon in Chinese mythology. The program is structured in 3 phases. The first phase is orbiting the moon. The second phase is landing on the moon and returning samples. The third phase is putting humans on the moon. Each phase is broken down further into specific missions, each one building on the last, each one designed to test a specific capability that will be needed for the one after it. It is methodical, it is patient, and it is very, very serious. Now, here is the thing about patience. It doesn't make for exciting news. Nobody writes breathless articles about a country quietly executing Phase 1 of a long-term plan. There's no dramatic rocket explosion to cover, no billionaire tweeting about it, no congressional hearing demanding answers. China just went to work, and for years, the rest of the world barely noticed. The first Chang'e mission launched in October 2007. Chang'e 1 was an orbiter. It mapped the lunar surface in detail, gathered data about the chemical composition of the soil, measured radiation levels, and helped Chinese engineers understand the environment their future missions would have to survive. It was a success. Chang'e 2 followed in 2010, this time with better cameras and higher resolution mapping. Also a success. 4-2. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 began with Chang'e 3 in December 2013. This was a lander and rover mission. The lander touched down in a region called Mare Imbrium, the Sea of Rains. It deployed a rover named U2, which means Jade Rabbit. And just like that, China became only the 3rd country in history to achieve a soft landing on the moon. The United States and the Soviet Union had done it before. Now China had done it. And U2 rolled out onto the surface and started exploring. But Chang'e 4 is where things started to get genuinely extraordinary. Because Chang'e 4 didn't land on the near side of the moon, the side that always faces the Earth. It landed on the far side, and that had never been done before, by anyone, ever. January 2019. Chang'e 4 touched down in the von Karman crater, inside the South Pole Aitken Basin. This is one of the largest and oldest impact craters in the entire solar system. Scientists had wanted to explore this region for decades because the impact that created it may have exposed material from deep inside the lunar interior, giving us a window into what the moon is actually made of beneath its surface. The problem with the far side of the moon is that you can't communicate with a spacecraft there directly. The moon itself is in the way. So China launched a relay satellite called Kuo-Chao, which means Magpie Bridge, and placed it in a special orbit behind the moon where it could bounce signals between Earth and the lander. Nobody had done that either. Chang'e 4 landed, deployed a second U-2 rover, and has been operating ever since. It remains the longest operating rover on the lunar surface. Chang'e 5 launched in November 2020, and this one was something else entirely. It landed on the moon, drilled into the surface, collected 1.7 kilograms of lunar soil and rock samples, launched a small ascent vehicle from the lunar surface, docked that vehicle with an orbiter waiting above, transferred the samples, and then flew them back to Earth, where they landed safely in Inner Mongolia in December 2020. The entire mission took 23 days from launch to sample return. It was the first time any country had returned samples from the moon since the Soviet Luna 24 mission in 1976. That's a 44-year gap, and China did it on the first try. Take a moment to appreciate what Chang'e 5 actually demonstrated. Landing softly on the moon. Check. Drilling and sample collection on the surface. Check. Launching a rocket from the surface of the moon. Check. Orbital rendezvous and docking above the moon. Check. Returning a capsule to Earth at lunar return velocity. Check. Every single one of those capabilities is required for a crewed lunar mission. Every one. Chang'e 5 was not just a science mission, it was a dress rehearsal, and China knew exactly what it was doing. Now let's talk about what NASA was doing during all of this. Not to criticize NASA, because that would be deeply unfair to an agency full of brilliant and dedicated people who have achieved things that are genuinely without parallel in human history, but to understand why the timeline looks the way it does, because the contrast is striking and the reasons for it matter. After the Apollo program ended in 1972, NASA didn't have a crewed lunar mission plan for the better part of 3 decades. The space shuttle was the focus, then the International Space Station. Then in 2004, President George W. Bush announced the Vision for Space Exploration, which called for returning humans to the moon by 2020. NASA began developing the Constellation program, new rockets, new capsules, a genuine return to the moon. The program was called Ares, named after the Greek god of war, and the crew capsule was called Orion. Work began, money was spent, progress was made. Then in 2010, President Obama canceled Constellation. The moon plan was gone. NASA was redirected toward a vague goal of eventually reaching an asteroid and then eventually Mars. Orion survived in a modified form, but the rocket program was restructured. The Space Launch System, or SLS, rose from the ashes of Ares, but it took years longer and cost billions more than anyone expected. Then in 2017, President Trump announced the Artemis program, humans back on the moon, this time by 2024. That date slipped. Then it slipped again. NASA selected SpaceX's Starship as the human landing system, which led to a lawsuit from Blue Origin that delayed things further. The date moved to 2025, then to 2026, then further still. As of right now, the most optimistic credible estimates put the first crewed Artemis lunar landing sometime around 2027 at the absolute earliest, with many analysts considering 2028 or later to be more realistic. China's current target for its first crewed moon landing is 2030, so the race is real, and it is genuinely close. But here's what makes China's timeline more credible than it might initially appear to be. They're not just announcing a date and hoping the technology catches up. They are actively building and testing the systems they need right now. Let's go through them one by one because this is where the story gets really interesting. To land humans on the moon, you need a few fundamental things. You need a rocket powerful enough to get you there. You need a spacecraft to carry the crew. You need a lander to take them from lunar orbit down to the surface, and you need the life support, navigation, and communication systems to keep everyone alive and bring them home. China is currently developing all of these simultaneously. The rocket is called Long March 10. This is China's next-generation heavy-lift launch vehicle, designed specifically for crewed lunar missions. It is a massive rocket, standing around 90 meters tall, capable of delivering approximately 27 metric tons to translunar injection, meaning it can throw 27 tons in the direction of the moon. For comparison, NASA's Space Launch System Block 1 can deliver about 27 metric tons to the same trajectory. They are essentially the same class of rocket in terms of lunar payload capacity. Long March 10 has been in active development for several years, with component testing already underway. Chinese officials have stated that it is on track for its first test flight before the crewed mission, which is how it needs to work. The crew spacecraft for the lunar mission is a new generation capsule that China has already flown and tested. In May 2020, China launched an uncrewed prototype of this new spacecraft on a Long March 5B rocket. The capsule completed a test flight, re-entered the atmosphere at lunar return velocity, meaning the very high speed a spacecraft reaches when coming back from the moon rather than from low Earth orbit, and landed successfully. That's an important test because re-entry from lunar distances is faster and hotter than re-entry from the space station, and the heat shield and guidance systems have to handle that. China's new capsule passed the test on the first try. The lander is called Lanyue. It is a two-stage design, with a descent stage that carries the crew from lunar orbit down to the surface, and an ascent stage that brings them back up to rendezvous with the waiting crew capsule in orbit. The overall architecture is actually somewhat similar to the Apollo lunar module concept, which makes sense because that concept works. You don't reinvent a solution to a problem that's already been solved, you refine it. Lanyue is being designed to carry 2 taikonauts, which is the term for Chinese astronauts, from lunar orbit down to the surface and back. The system is currently in development and component-level testing. China is also building a new spacesuit for lunar surface operations. Spacewalking suits used at the International Space Station are not suitable for walking on the moon. The environment is completely different. You need mobility for walking on an uneven surface, protection against the extreme temperature swings between lunar day and lunar night, resistance to the abrasive lunar dust, which is nothing like dust on Earth and has been known to cause serious problems with mechanical systems, and the ability to operate during moonwalks that could last several hours. China has been publicly developing this suit, with state media showing images of prototype hardware and engineers conducting tests in simulated lunar gravity environments. And then there's the infrastructure question, because going to the moon once is not the point. Going to the moon and staying is the point. China has announced plans to establish a permanent research station at the lunar South Pole called the International Lunar Research Station. Yes, international. China has been actively recruiting partner nations for this project and has already signed agreements with Russia and several other countries. The ILS is intended to become a permanent outpost on the moon, not a temporary camp. China's vision for the moon is not Apollo. It's not flags and footprints and come home with rocks. It's a sustained presence, a base, infrastructure. The lunar South Pole is where everyone wants to be, and that's not a coincidence. Permanently shadowed craters at the lunar South Pole are believed to contain significant deposits of water ice. Water on the moon is not just useful for drinking. Water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen is what astronauts breathe. Hydrogen and oxygen together make rocket propellant. If you can mine water ice from the moon's south pole and process it into propellant, you can refuel spacecraft on the moon itself. You can use the moon as a refueling depot for missions going deeper into the solar system. The moon's water ice is potentially one of the most strategically valuable resources in the near solar system, and the South Pole craters that contain it are finite. There's only so much prime real estate. The country that gets there first and establishes a presence gets a significant advantage. NASA's Artemis program is also targeting the lunar South Pole. SpaceX's Starship lunar lander is designed to land near the South Pole. The Artemis base camp concept is located at the South Pole. Everyone knows where the valuable territory is. And there are real questions being asked by serious people about what happens when both the United States and China are trying to land near the same craters at the South Pole at the same time. Space law, as it currently stands, does not give any country ownership of the moon or its resources. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 says so explicitly. But the Artemis Accords, which the United States has been promoting and which dozens of countries have signed, do carve out provisions for the extraction and use of space resources. China and Russia have not signed the Artemis Accords. They are developing their own framework. Two different legal and operational frameworks, two competing visions for how the moon gets used. That is not an abstract diplomatic issue. That is a practical problem that will have to be resolved, one way or another. Now let's talk about something that gets overlooked in most coverage of this subject. The pace of China's space program is not just about the moon. It's about everything happening simultaneously. While the lunar program is developing, China is also operating and expanding its own space station called Tiangong, which means Heavenly Palace. The station became operational in 2022 and has been continuously crewed since then. Chinese taikonauts rotate through on 6-month missions, conducting scientific experiments, performing spacewalks, and accumulating the long-duration spaceflight experience that is essential for deep space missions. Every 6-month rotation of taikonauts on Tiangong is producing data about how the human body responds to long-duration weightlessness, and those taikonauts are gaining experience that will directly apply to lunar missions. China has also been running a series of robotic missions to the moon that are directly tied to the crewed program. Chang'e 6, which launched in May 2024, did something that was widely described as impossible just a few years ago. It landed on the far side of the moon, specifically in the South Pole Aitken Basin, drilled into the surface, collected samples, launched from the far side, and returned those samples to Earth. This was the first time samples had ever been collected from the far side of the moon. Scientists were extraordinarily excited about this because the far side of the moon is geologically different from the near side in ways that are not fully understood, and those samples contain information about the early solar system that cannot be found anywhere else. Chang'e 6 returned approximately 1.9 kilograms of material from the far side, a landmark achievement in planetary science. And in the context of the crewed lunar program, another successful demonstration of landing, sample collection, ascent from the lunar surface, and sample return. Chang'e 7 is currently planned to launch before the crewed mission, with the specific goal of scouting the lunar South Pole region in detail, including the use of a small flying probe designed to enter permanently shadowed craters and look for direct evidence of water ice. This is reconnaissance for the crewed missions that will follow. Chang'e 8 is planned to test technologies for in-situ resource utilization, meaning using materials found on the moon rather than bringing everything from Earth. Things like processing lunar regolith, testing construction techniques using lunar soil, and exploring whether local resources can support a long-term presence. These are not abstract experiments. They are specific technological demonstrations required for the International Lunar Research Station that China intends to build. This is a complete program, not a single mission or even a handful of missions, but a sequence of interconnected missions, each designed to test and validate what comes next. It's the kind of systematic approach that NASA used in the 1960s during the original moon race. Gemini tested rendezvous and docking. Apollo tested the systems needed for landing. Each mission built on the previous one. China is doing exactly that, and they started doing it 20 years ago. Let's spend some time on something that often gets reduced to a single sentence in articles about this topic, which is funding. Because money is the engine that drives everything, and the difference in how the United States and China fund their space programs reveals something important about why the timelines look the way they do. NASA's annual budget is around $25 billion. That is not a small amount of money. NASA does extraordinary things with that budget, but it's worth understanding what that money has to cover. NASA funds human spaceflight. It funds robotic planetary science missions to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the outer solar system. It funds Earth science satellites that monitor climate and weather. It funds astrophysics, including the James Webb Space Telescope and its eventual successors. It funds aeronautics research. It funds technology development programs. It funds education and outreach. $25 billion sounds like a lot, but it is spread across an enormous range of activities, and within that budget, the Artemis program is competing with everything else for resources. Additionally, NASA's budget is subject to the annual congressional appropriations process, which means it can go up or down each year depending on political priorities, budget negotiations, and the overall fiscal environment. Long-term programs at NASA are chronically vulnerable to budget fluctuations and political shifts. Constellation was fully canceled. Artemis has seen its share of budget pressures. The SLS has been questioned by critics who argue that SpaceX's Starship could do the same job for a fraction of the cost, and those debates create uncertainty that can slow programs down even when the underlying engineering is progressing. China's space budget is harder to pin down precisely because not all of it is publicly disclosed, and some components are embedded within military budgets. But credible estimates from analysts who study this carefully put China's annual space spending somewhere between $10 and $15 billion, with some estimates going higher when you factor in all related spending. That number is growing rapidly. In percentage terms, China's space budget has been growing faster than NASA's for years. And crucially, the political environment in China means that once a program is approved at the national level, it doesn't face the same year-to-year vulnerability that NASA programs face. The lunar program has political backing at the highest levels of the Chinese government. It is tied to national prestige in a way that makes it essentially immune to the budget reshuffling that has derailed American programs in the past. This is not a statement about which system of government is better. It's an observation about which system of government is better at sustaining a multi-decade space program with consistent funding and consistent political commitment. And on that very specific question, the track record over the last 20 years suggests that China's system has an advantage. There's another dimension to this story that doesn't get discussed enough, and it's the human dimension. Not the taikonauts who will fly to the moon, but the engineers and scientists who are building the systems that will get them there. China has been producing more engineering and science graduates than any other country in the world for years. The sheer scale of STEM education in China is difficult to overstate. That human capital is flowing into China's aerospace industry, which is growing rapidly. Companies like CASC, the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, which is the main organization responsible for the crewed lunar program, are staffed by generations of engineers who grew up watching China's space program achieve one milestone after another. This creates a culture of institutional confidence, a sense that the program can do what it sets out to do because it has done what it set out to do before. NASA has brilliant people. SpaceX has brilliant people. The American aerospace ecosystem is deep and sophisticated, but it is also competing for talent with Silicon Valley, with Wall Street, with every other industry that values smart technical people and pays accordingly. China's top space engineers are working on missions that are explicitly tied to national pride and national strategic goals, and the program they're working on has a consistent track record of success. That's a powerful environment for getting things done. Now let's talk about SpaceX, because you cannot have a serious conversation about the moon race without talking about Elon Musk's company, and the role it plays in this story is genuinely complicated. SpaceX has achieved things that were widely regarded as impossible before they happened. Reusable orbital rockets, routine private crew transport to the International Space Station, the Falcon Heavy, and now Starship, which, if it works as designed, will be the most powerful launch vehicle in history, capable of delivering more payload to orbit than anything that has ever flown. Starship is the vehicle NASA selected to land Artemis astronauts on the moon. Without Starship, there is no Artemis lunar landing. Starship's development has been dramatic. The vehicle has gone through a series of increasingly successful test flights, with early versions exploding spectacularly, which SpaceX has always insisted is a normal part of rapid iterative development, and later versions achieving significant milestones including successful launches, spaceflight, and controlled re-entry. The pace of development at SpaceX is genuinely unlike anything seen in traditional aerospace. They test, they fail, they learn, they rebuild, and they do it fast. But Starship is not ready for humans on the moon. Not yet. The vehicle needs to be refueled in orbit for a lunar mission, which requires multiple launches and on-orbit propellant transfer, a capability that has not yet been demonstrated. The lunar lander variant of Starship needs to be developed and tested. The vehicle needs to complete uncrewed lunar missions before it can be trusted to carry humans. All of that takes time, and the timeline for all of those steps keeps shifting. This is partly because SpaceX is doing something genuinely hard, and partly because of the nature of private commercial development, where timelines are aspirational rather than contractual in the way that government program timelines are supposed to be. The optimistic scenario for Artemis is that everything goes right with Starship, that the NASA crewed missions come together on schedule, and that humans stand on the moon before China's mission. The more realistic scenario, based on the actual history of how both programs have progressed, is that it will be very close. And the non-trivial scenario, which serious analysts take seriously, is that China gets there first. What would it mean if China lands humans on the moon before the United States? This question is worth sitting with for a moment, because the implications go well beyond national pride. During the original space race in the 1960s, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was about more than rockets. It was about proving which political and economic system could produce more innovation, more capability, more technological power. When Sputnik beeped its way across the sky in 1957, it wasn't just a satellite, it was a statement. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, it wasn't just a landing, it was an answer to that statement. The world was watching, and the message was received. If China lands humans on the moon before the United States, it will be a statement, not about military power, not about economic output, not about any of the conventional measures of national capability. It will be about the ability to do the hardest thing. Space exploration is uniquely powerful as a demonstration of national capability precisely because it is so difficult. You cannot fake it. You cannot manufacture the appearance of success. Either the rocket works or it doesn't. Either the lander touches down gently or it crashes. Either the taikonauts plant a flag on the moon or they don't. The universe doesn't grade on a curve, and that statement will be heard clearly by every developing nation that is currently choosing which great power to align with, which technology to adopt, which economic model to follow. In a world where the United States and China are competing for influence across the developing world, across Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America and the Middle East, a Chinese moon landing would be an extraordinary piece of soft power, not because it changes anyone's military situation, but because it changes the story. It changes the perception of who the future belongs to. This is not alarmism, it's history. The original moon landing changed the story. A Chinese moon landing would change the story again. Now let's get into some of the technical details that most coverage skips over, because the engineering challenges involved in getting humans to the moon are genuinely fascinating, and understanding them helps you appreciate why this is hard for everyone, not just NASA. The moon is about 384,000 kilometers from Earth on average. That number sounds manageable until you start thinking about what it means in practice. A spacecraft traveling to the moon at typical transfer speeds takes about 3 days to get there. 3 days during which the crew is exposed to radiation, cosmic rays, solar particle events, all the things that Earth's magnetic field normally protects us from. 3 days during which any failure in any system has to be handled by the crew themselves, because at the distances involved, and the communication speeds available, ground control can help you think through a problem, but they cannot fix your hardware. The crew has to be self-sufficient in a way that astronauts on the International Space Station are not. The thermal environment on the moon is brutal. In sunlight, the surface temperature can reach 127 degrees Celsius. In shadow, it drops to minus 173 degrees Celsius. That 300-degree swing happens over the course of a lunar day, which is about 29 Earth days long. Equipment that works fine at room temperature can crack, seize, or fail catastrophically at these extremes. The Apollo program only operated on the lunar surface for at most a few days at a time. If you want to stay longer, you have to engineer systems that can survive and operate across the full thermal cycle. Lunar dust is one of the most underappreciated hazards of working on the moon. It is not like dust on Earth. Lunar soil has been ground down by billions of years of meteorite impacts in a vacuum, which means the particles are jagged and abrasive at the microscopic level, rather than smooth and rounded the way dust gets on Earth, where wind and water wear down the sharp edges over time. This abrasive dust gets into everything. It wears out mechanical seals, it scratches optical surfaces, it coats solar panels and reduces their efficiency. Apollo astronauts found that lunar dust was one of the most challenging practical problems they dealt with, and they were only there for days. A permanent base would have to solve the dust problem properly, and that requires engineering solutions that are still being developed. The communication delay between Earth and the Moon is about 1.3 seconds each way, so 2.6 seconds round trip. That's not a lot, but it's enough to make real-time remote control of lunar surface vehicles awkward. For crewed missions, the communication works fine for conversation, but for operating robotic systems on the lunar surface from Earth, the delay adds complexity. As missions become more ambitious and operations more complex, communication architecture becomes increasingly important. Power is another fundamental challenge. Solar panels work on the Moon, but not in permanently shadowed craters where the water ice is. And during the 2-week lunar night, solar power is unavailable across much of the surface. Nuclear power is the most viable solution for continuous lunar surface operations. China has been developing space nuclear power systems, including a fission-based power reactor intended for lunar surface use. NASA and the Department of Energy have also been working on a fission surface power system under the Kilopower program. Nuclear power on the Moon is not science fiction. It is a current engineering development effort in multiple countries. Whoever gets their nuclear power system operating on the lunar surface first gains a significant advantage in being able to operate through the lunar night and in the permanently shadowed regions where the resources are. Radiation is a sustained challenge that will define the long-term human presence on the Moon in ways that we are still figuring out. The Moon has no magnetic field and no atmosphere, which means the surface is exposed to the full spectrum of cosmic radiation, galactic cosmic rays, and solar particle events. Galactic cosmic rays are particularly tricky because they come from all directions and are very difficult to shield against. Heavy shielding adds mass, which adds cost. Lunar regolith itself can be used as shielding, which is one reason why early lunar base designs often call for burying or covering habitat modules with lunar soil. But even with regolith shielding, crews living on the Moon for extended periods will accumulate radiation doses that need to be carefully managed within career limits. China's space medicine program has been working on these problems actively. Long-duration missions on Tiangong provide data on how the human body handles radiation, bone density loss, muscle atrophy, immune system changes, cardiovascular deconditioning, and all the other physiological effects of living in space. That data is directly applicable to planning lunar surface missions and eventual deep space missions. There is something almost philosophical about the moment we're in right now. Humans have not walked on the Moon in over 50 years. A child born in 1972, the last time human footprints were pressed into lunar soil, is now past 50 years old. We are at the end of the longest gap in human lunar activity that we will ever experience, because from this point forward, humans are going back. The only question is when and under whose flag they first return. The Apollo era felt like the beginning of something. There was a sense that this was the first step, that a permanent human presence beyond Earth was just a matter of time, that the Moon would be settled and Mars would be next, and the outer solar system would follow. And then Apollo ended, and the shuttle came, and the station came, and the decades passed and the Moon stayed empty of human presence. That wasn't anyone's failure in particular. It was the result of 1,000 political and budget and prioritization decisions made over 50 years, none of which individually seemed like the decision to abandon the Moon. But together, they added up to 5 decades of absence. Now the conditions are different. Now there is competition, and competition, for all of its complications, has a way of producing results. The original Moon landing happened because the United States refused to let the Soviet Union be the first to put a human on the Moon. The competition was the point. The competition was the fuel. Without the Soviet space program pushing NASA, without Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, and the very real possibility that the United States was going to lose this contest, it is genuinely unclear whether Apollo would have happened when it did, or at all. We are in that moment again. The competition is real. The stakes are real. And this time, both competitors have capabilities that neither of them had in the 1960s. The computing power available to mission planners today versus what was available to the Apollo teams is not marginally better. It is incomparably better. The material science, the propulsion technology, the life support systems, the communication systems, the understanding of the lunar environment built up through 50 years of robotic exploration, all of this represents an enormous foundation on which to build. Whoever gets back to the moon first is returning not to an unknown world, but to a world that has been mapped and analyzed and studied in extraordinary detail. China's robotic program has been an especially valuable contributor to that knowledge base. The Chang'e missions have generated data about the lunar South Pole, about the composition of the lunar soil, about the far side, about subsurface structure, that will directly inform the planning of crewed missions. The samples returned by Chang'e 5 from the Rumka region and by Chang'e 6 from the far side are being analyzed by scientists around the world, including scientists in the United States and Europe who received portions of those samples through collaborative agreements. Science doesn't care about national borders. The moon is everyone's laboratory, but the moon as a strategic location is something different, and the strategic dimension is undeniable. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space and prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies. But it does not prohibit using the moon as a base for operations that provide significant military advantages. Space-based sensors, communication relays, even the theoretical ability to control access to cislunar space, the region between Earth and the Moon, are all within the legal framework as it currently stands. The United States military's Space Force has been explicit about the strategic importance of cislunar space. Chinese military strategists have written about it too. The Moon's strategic value as a high-ground position relative to Earth is something both sides are aware of, and neither side is discussing openly very much. This is one of the reasons why the moon race of the 2020s feels genuinely different from the moon race of the 1960s. In the 1960s, the competition was largely about prestige and ideology. In the 2020s, there are real resources on the moon that have real economic value. There is real strategic value to cislunar space. There are real territorial dynamics emerging around the South Pole. The competition is not purely symbolic. It has tangible dimensions that will matter for decades. Let's come back to something concrete. What specifically does China have to accomplish between now and 2030 to actually land humans on the moon? Long March 10 needs to complete at least one successful test flight. This is probably the most critical single milestone on the path to a crewed lunar landing. A new rocket's first flight is always a risk. The history of spaceflight is filled with first flights that didn't go as planned. China needs Long March 10 to fly successfully before they can plan crewed missions around it. The new generation crew spacecraft needs to complete crewed missions in Earth orbit. The uncrewed test in 2020 validated the design in a general sense, but crewed orbital missions are needed before trusting the vehicle with a lunar crew. China has been preparing for this. The Lanyue lunar lander needs to be tested. An uncrewed test landing on the moon, similar to how NASA is planning to use uncrewed Starship flights before crewed ones, would be the logical approach. Whether China manages to squeeze in an uncrewed lander test before their crewed mission will be one of the interesting questions to watch in the next few years. Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8 need to complete their missions and validate the South Pole as a viable landing zone, map the water ice deposits, and test the resource utilization technology. These missions are on the schedule, and the plan appears to be proceeding. The taikonauts who will fly to the moon need to be selected, trained, and ready. China has been steadily expanding its astronaut corps. The third batch of taikonauts selected in 2020 includes specialists in science and engineering, not just pilots, reflecting the evolving nature of Chinese space missions. Lunar-specific training will include geology, because moonwalks on a science mission involve field geology just like the Apollo astronauts did, as well as operating in spacesuits on simulated lunar surfaces, working with drilling and sample collection equipment, and all the specific skills that surface operations will require. All of these things are in progress simultaneously. The question is whether all of them will come together on schedule, because space programs almost never run exactly on schedule. Unexpected problems arise. Testing reveals issues that require redesign. Supply chains have hiccups. The history of every space program in every country includes delays and setbacks. The difference between China's program and past programs that slipped decades on their timelines is that China has a track record. They said Chang'e 1 would orbit the moon, and it did. They said Chang'e 3 would soft land on the moon, and it did. They said Chang'e 4 would land on the far side of the moon, and it did. They said Chang'e 5 would return samples, and it did. They said Chang'e 6 would return samples from the far side, and it did. When China says they will do something with their space program, the track record says they will. That track record is worth a lot, not as propaganda, not as chest thumping, but as evidence about how this particular organization actually performs. It performs well, consistently, against ambitious goals, and the crewed lunar program is the logical culmination of everything they have built over 20 years. There's one more thing that deserves attention before we bring all of this together, and that's the question of what comes after the moon, because the moon is not the end of this story. It's the beginning of a new chapter in a much longer story. Both the United States and China have stated goals of eventually sending humans to Mars. NASA's long-term vision involves the moon as a proving ground for Mars, a place to develop and test the life support, propulsion, and operational techniques that deep space missions will require. China's long-term vision is similar. The International Lunar Research Station is not just a moon base, it's a template for how you build a permanent human presence on another world. The technologies required to sustain humans on the moon, in situ resource utilization, nuclear power, closed-loop life support, long-duration radiation protection, are the same technologies required to sustain humans on Mars. The moon is close enough to Earth that you can recover from mistakes, that you can resupply within days, that you can evacuate a crew in an emergency within a few days if you have a return vehicle. Mars is months away. Everything has to work before you go there. The moon is where you make it work. The international dimension of all this is also evolving rapidly. China's International Lunar Research Station has attracted partners. Russia is involved, though Russia's own space program has faced significant challenges in recent years, following geopolitical isolation after the invasion of Ukraine. But Pakistan, Venezuela, South Africa, Belarus, and others have signed cooperation agreements with China's lunar program. This is not a trivial coalition. It represents an alternative international framework for space exploration to the American-led Artemis Accords. Both frameworks are trying to define the norms and rules for how humanity operates in cislunar space. The one that can point to a successful crewed moon landing will have enormous credibility in that normative debate. The Artemis Accords currently have over 40 signatories, including Japan, Canada, the European Space Agency members, Australia, South Korea, and most of the major Western spacefaring nations. These are serious partners who are contributing real hardware, real science, and real investment to the Artemis program. The Canadian Space Agency is contributing an advanced robotic arm for the Gateway Lunar Space Station. Japan's JAXA is contributing life support systems and other hardware. The European Space Agency is contributing service modules for the Orion capsule. Artemis is genuinely international in a meaningful sense, but so is China's program, and the competition between these two coalitions for additional partners is happening right now, in real time, across the developing world. This is the moon race of the 2020s. It is not two countries competing. It is two visions of how humanity should explore and eventually settle space. Two frameworks for international partnership. Two technological approaches, one with a heavy reliance on private commercial innovation through companies like SpaceX, one with a strong state-driven centralized planning approach. Both approaches have real advantages. Both have real disadvantages. And the outcome of the competition between them will shape the trajectory of human spaceflight for the rest of this century. We started this video with a simple observation. Something is happening that most people don't know about. China is on a credible trajectory to land humans on the moon before NASA and SpaceX.